Forget what you've seen in the movies. The real outlaws of the Old West were a different breed of terror. We're counting down the 12 most dangerous figures ever to ride the plains, including a man who claimed he never took a life he didn't have to. The truth is shocking. 1. John Wesley Hardin. Let's kick things off with a name that sent shivers down the spine of anyone who heard it. John Wesley Hardin. This guy wasn't your average outlaw. Truth be told, he was in a league of his own when it came to being dangerous. Born in Texas in 1853, Hardin started his troublesome career at a very young age. Can you believe he was only 15 years old when he had his first major run-in with the law? The story goes that he got into a disagreement with a man and, well, that man didn't walk away from it. From that day on, Hardin was on the run. He wasn't just a wild young man. He was smart, cold, and incredibly fast with a pistol. He even developed a special holster setup where his pistols were sewn into his vest, allowing him to draw them with lightning speed. He spent years as a cowboy, a trail boss, and all-around troublemaker, getting into scrapes all over Texas and beyond. The number of men who met their end because of him is staggering. He claimed the number was over 40, and while that might be a bit of an exaggeration, even the confirmed count is sky high. He was eventually caught by the famous Texas Rangers and sent to prison. He actually studied law while behind bars and became a lawyer when he got out. But his old ways caught up to him, and his story ended in a saloon, a classic end for a Wild West figure. Hardin was a truly fearsome man, no doubt about it. But as grown and dangerous as he was, our next outlaw became a legend while he was still just a boy. 2. Billy the Kid. You've definitely heard of this next fellow. His name is known all over the world, Billy the Kid. He's one of the most famous outlaws of all time, and his story is like something straight out of a movie. His real name was probably Henry McCarty, but he went by many names throughout his short life. He was born in the big city of New York, but ended up in the dusty territories of New Mexico, where his life of crime began. He wasn't a big guy. In fact, he was described as being skinny with bright blue eyes and a charming smile, which made him all the more surprising. His legend really took off during a massive conflict known as the Lincoln County War. This was basically a battle between two rival groups of businessmen, and Billy found himself right in the middle of it. He joined a group of lawmen called the Regulators, who were trying to bring justice for their fallen boss. This is where Billy's reputation as a gunslinger grew. He was involved in several major showdowns and became one of the most wanted men in the West. He was eventually captured and sentenced to be hanged, but he pulled off one of the most daring escapes in history. He managed to get a hold of a weapon, dispatched his 2 guards, and rode out of town singing. His freedom didn't last long, though. He was tracked down by Sheriff Pat Garrett, and his story came to a sudden end in a dark room in Fort Sumner. He was only 21 years old. Billy the Kid was a symbol of youthful rebellion. But while he fought in a war, our next outlaw led a gang that fought its own war against the railroads and banks. 3. Jesse James. When you think of a train robber, chances are the first name that pops into your head is Jesse James. Along with his brother Frank, Jesse led the James Younger Gang, one of the most successful and notorious gangs in American history. Jesse was from Missouri, and his story is tied up with the aftermath of the Civil War. He and his brother rode with a group of fighters during the war, and when it ended, they used their rough skills to start a new career, taking what they wanted from banks, trains, and stagecoaches. The James Younger Gang was incredibly bold. They planned their robberies carefully and were known for being absolutely ruthless during their getaways. For over a decade, they were the most feared men in the Midwest. Newspapers loved writing about them, and some people even saw them as heroes, like a modern-day Robin Hood, stealing from the rich railroad and bank companies. Of course, the lawmen and the people who got caught in the crossfire didn't see it that way. The gang's reign of terror came to a crashing halt during a botched bank robbery in Northfield, Minnesota. The townspeople fought back, and the gang was nearly wiped out. Jesse and Frank were 2 of the only ones to escape. Jesse tried to start a new gang and a new life, but he was always looking over his shoulder. In the end, it wasn't a lawman who got him. It was a new member of his own gang, a man named Robert Ford, who ended Jesse's life in his own home to collect the reward money. Jesse James's betrayal is a famous story of an outlaw's end. But if you think that's a shocking way to go, wait until you hear about our next gunslinger, a man who was so wild people called him the meanest man in the West. 4. Clay Allison. Now, let's talk about a man who was a different kind of dangerous. His name was Clay Allison, and he was known for having a temper as hot as a branding iron and a personality as wild as a tornado. He wasn't a typical outlaw who robbed banks for a living. Instead, he was a cattle rancher from Texas who just happened to be one of the most feared gunfighters of his time. Truth be told, many of the stories about him are so wild, it's hard to know what's real and what's just tall tale. But even if half of them are true, he was one scary dude. Allison had a reputation for being unpredictable. One minute he could be friendly and charming, and the next he could fly into a rage. He was involved in a whole heap of showdowns, and he usually came out on top. One of his most famous encounters was with a man named Chunk Colbert. The story goes that they sat down to dinner together, and Chunk tried to get the drop on Allison. But Allison was so fast, he drew his pistol and dispatched Colbert before the man could even get a proper shot off. After that, his legend only grew. He had a personal code of honor in a way. He mostly got into trouble with other gunfighters or people he thought deserved it. Still, you did not want to be on his bad side. His end was not what you'd expect for such a feared gunslinger. He didn't go down in a blaze of glory. Believe it or not, he met his maker after falling from a wagon. A strange and quiet end for such a loud and violent man. Clay Allison was a force of nature, a one-man wrecking crew. But as tough as he was alone, our next outlaw was even more dangerous because of the pure terror he caused in the days after the Civil War. 5. Colin Baker. The name Colin Baker might not be as famous as Jesse James or Billy the Kid, but in the corner of Texas and Arkansas where he roamed, he was a true terror. They called him the Swamp Fox of the Sulphur River, and his story is a dark one. Baker was a veteran of the Civil War, and it seems the fighting never really left him. After the war, he became the leader of a gang that caused absolute mayhem in the region. He was a big, mean man with a fearsome temper and a deep-seated hatred for the new government that was in charge after the war. He and his gang were involved in all sorts of terrible business. They roamed the countryside, and folks lived in constant fear of them. They were known for being incredibly violent, and stories of their misdeeds spread like wildfire. Baker himself was a very dangerous man with a gun and was said to be responsible for the end of many lives. He was so feared that for a time, he was practically the ruler of his little patch of the woods. Lawmen tried to go after him, but the swampy, difficult terrain was his backyard, and he knew how to disappear into it. He was a ghost, a bogeyman that parents used to scare their children. His reign of terror couldn't last forever, though. The story of his end is a bit murky, but the most popular version is that he was finally taken down not by the law, but by a group of citizens who had simply had enough of his wicked ways. Colin Baker was a man who thrived on chaos. Our next outlaw wasn't about chaos so much as he was about getting rich quick, and he inspired a whole generation of outlaws who came after him. 6. Sam Bass. Let's head back to Texas for the story of a man whose outlaw career was short but incredibly spectacular. His name was Sam Bass, and he's remembered for pulling off one of the biggest train robberies in the history of the Old West. Unlike some of the other characters on our list, Sam Bass didn't start out as a mean-spirited troublemaker. By most accounts, he was a pretty friendly and likable guy. He worked various jobs, from a farmhand to a cowboy, but he just couldn't seem to make a good, honest living. He wanted the easy money. So, he formed a gang and started small, robbing stagecoaches. But Sam had bigger dreams. He and his gang decided to go after a Union Pacific train in Big Springs, Nebraska. And boy, did they hit the jackpot. They found a whopping $60,000 in brand new $20 gold pieces in the express car. That's millions of dollars in today's money. The news of the massive robbery spread everywhere, and Sam Bass became a household name overnight. With a huge price on his head, he and his gang fled back to Texas, but the law was hot on their trail. They tried to lay low, but it's hard to hide when you're the most wanted man in the country. The gang was eventually cornered, and in a final showdown in Round Rock, Texas, Sam Bass was badly wounded. His story ended a couple of days later, on his 27th birthday. Sam Bass was a classic robber, but the outlaws of the West weren't all men. The next person on our list shattered that mold and became the most famous bandit queen of her era. 7. Belle Starr. It's time to talk about one of the most fascinating figures of the Old West. A woman who proved that being an outlaw wasn't just a man's game. Her name was Myra Maybelle Shirley, but the world would come to know her as Belle Starr. She grew up in a respectable family in Missouri, but her life took a sharp turn when she got mixed up with some of the most notorious figures of the time, including the James and Younger brothers. She was drawn to the wildlife, and she learned how to ride and shoot as well as any man. Belle Starr was not your typical lady of the 1800s. She was tough, smart, and independent. She dressed in fine clothes but often wore 2 pistols on her hips. She moved to what was then called Indian Territory, a rough and lawless place, and her home became a well-known hideout for outlaws on the run. She was involved in horse rustling and other illegal activities, and she was arrested several times. The newspapers loved her. They gave her the nickname, the Bandit Queen, and wrote sensational stories about her adventures, many of which were probably made up. But the stories built her legend. She was a celebrity outlaw. Her life, like many on this list, came to a sudden and mysterious end. She was ambushed and sent to the great beyond by an unknown attacker. To this day, nobody is exactly sure who did it, adding one final mystery to the legend of Belle Starr. Belle Starr was an American-born legend, but our next outlaw came from south of the border and became a folk hero to some and a monster to others during the California Gold Rush. 8. Joaquin Murrieta. Let's ride west to the gold fields of California for a story that is wrapped in legend and mystery. The tale of Joaquin Murrieta is one of the most debated stories of the Old West. Was he a real person? Or was he just a myth, a collection of stories about several different bandits? Most historians believe he was real, and his story is a powerful one. The legend says that Murrieta came to California from Mexico in the 1850s, hoping to strike it rich during the gold rush. But instead of finding gold, he found trouble. The story goes that he and his family were treated horribly by American miners. They were driven from their home, and Murrieta decided he wanted revenge. He formed a gang, and they began a campaign of robbing and rampaging across the state. He was said to be a brilliant horseman and a cunning leader. To the authorities and the miners, he was a dangerous criminal. But to many of the Mexican people living in California, who were also being mistreated, he became a hero, a symbol of resistance against injustice. The state of California eventually put a huge bounty on his head and sent a group of rangers after him. The rangers claimed they found Murrieta and his gang, and in the ensuing fight, the famous bandit was taken down. As proof, they presented a jar containing what they claimed was his head. It's a gruesome end to a story that is still told around campfires in California. Murrieta's story is one of revenge. The next outlaw on our list was also driven by revenge, and he became one of the most feared feudists in the history of Texas. 9. Bill Long Lee. Some men were outlaws for money and some for fame, but our next character, Bill Long Lee, seemed to be in it for the pure, terrifying thrill of it. Known as Deadly Bill, he was one of the most dangerous men to ever walk the dusty streets of Texas. Like John Wesley Hardin, Longley had a very short fuse and an incredibly quick trigger finger. His outlaw career started just after the Civil War, a time of great turmoil and lawlessness in the South. He was a difficult man, known for his violent temper and his deep-seated grudges. Longley's life was a long string of violent encounters. He was part of several feuds and got into countless personal disputes, most of which ended with him being the only one walking away. He claimed to have ended the lives of over 30 people, and while he was known to stretch the truth, no one doubted he was a man to be feared. He wandered all over the western states, leaving a trail of trouble behind him. He was a master of disguise and used many different names to avoid the law. For a while, It seemed like no one could catch him. But his luck finally ran out. He was captured and put on trial for one of his many misdeeds. Before he was hanged, he wrote an autobiography, a story of his life, trying to explain his actions. In the end, though, he was remembered as one of Texas's most cold-hearted gunslingers. Bill Longley was a man who seemed to enjoy the chaos he created. But as fearsome as he was, our next outlaw led a gang that was known for a level of pure, terrifying mayhem that was almost unmatched. 10. Cherokee Bill. Let's travel back to Indian Territory, a place that was a haven for outlaws in the late 1800s. It was here that a young man named Crawford Goldsby would become one of the most feared bandits of his time, better known as Cherokee Bill. He had a mixed heritage, part Cherokee, part soldier, part white, and part black, and he grew up in a tough environment. He had a rebellious streak from a young age, and it wasn't long before he fell in with a bad crowd. At the age of 18, he had his first serious brush with the law, and from then on he was a full-blown outlaw. He and his gang went on a wild rampage that lasted for about 2 years. They robbed banks, stores, and train stations, and they were known for being incredibly reckless and dangerous. They didn't seem to care who got in their way, and many innocent people got caught in the middle of their violent crimes. Cherokee Bill himself earned a reputation as being particularly fearsome. The law, led by the famous Judge Isaac Parker, known as the Hanging Judge, made capturing him a top priority. He was eventually caught, but his story wasn't over. While in jail, he managed to get a hold of a smuggled pistol and tried to escape, leading to a tense standoff that left a guard without a life. He was recaptured, and his wild ride finally came to an end at the gallows in Fort Smith, Arkansas. He was only 20 years old. Cherokee Bill was reckless and openly dangerous. Our next outlaw was the exact opposite. He was a quiet, respectable-looking man who was secretly one of the most cold-blooded assassins for hire in the entire Old West. But what if the person hired to protect the town was also the one robbing it? The next man on our list did just that. 11. Tom Horn. Here's a story about a man who blurred the lines between lawman and outlaw until you couldn't tell which side he was really on. His name was Tom Horn, and he was one of the most mysterious and controversial figures of the late Old West. He had an incredible life even before he became infamous. He was an Army scout, a prospector, and even a champion rodeo cowboy. He was also a skilled tracker and a man who knew the wilderness like the back of his hand. It was these skills that got him hired by big cattle companies as a range detective. His job was to track down cattle rustlers, people who were stealing cows from the big ranches. And Tom Horn was very good at his job, maybe too good. You see, Horn had a particular way of dealing with rustlers. They would often turn up having met a very permanent and very sudden end. He was suspected of being a hired gun, an assassin for the cattle barons who wanted to get rid of smaller ranchers they accused of stealing. For a long time, he was just a whisper, a ghost who delivered deadly justice on the range. But his career came to an end when he was accused of ending the life of a 14-year-old boy, the son of a sheep rancher, supposedly by mistake. The evidence against him was shaky, and some say he was framed. He was put on trial, and in a case that drew national attention, he was found guilty and sentenced to hang. A controversial end for a man who lived his life in the gray area between the law and the wild. Tom Horn was a man of many talents, but his true nature was a mystery. Our next outlaw was also a man of mystery, a well-educated man from a good family who became one of the most feared members of a notorious gang of cowboys. 12. Johnny Ringo. The name Johnny Ringo brings to mind images of a dark, brooding gunfighter, a man with a troubled soul. And truth be told, that picture isn't far from the truth. John Peters Ringo was different from many of his outlaw peers. He was from a good family and was said to be well-educated. He could even quote Shakespeare. But a series of tragic events in his youth seemed to set him on a dark path. He ended up in Arizona, in the notorious town of Tombstone, where he fell in with a rough crowd known as the Cowboys. The Cowboys were a loose-knit group of ranchers and rustlers who were constantly at odds with the town's lawmen, including the famous Wyatt Earp and his brothers. Johnny Ringo quickly gained a reputation as one of the most dangerous of the bunch. He was known for his moody personality and his quick temper, especially when he was drinking. He had a stare that could make a brave man nervous, and he was known to be deadly with a pistol. He was involved in several violent disputes and was a sworn enemy of the Earp brothers and their friend, Doc Holliday. After the famous shootout at the OK Blank Corral, Ringo was a key player in the bloody vendetta that followed. His end is one of the great mysteries of the Old West. He was found in a grove of trees, having met his end from a single gunshot. Whether he took his own life or was secretly taken down by an enemy like Wyatt Earp is a secret the desert has never given up.